in exile, and the Lord reminded him of what he had learned when he stood in the Holy of Holies. Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Isaiah 40:21-22. The prophet of the exile had seen the future of his people as he stood in the beginning at the foundation of the earth. When Jesus was in the wilderness, the devil set him on a high place in the temple, and he also took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment. Luke 4:5. In the book of Revelation, John was summoned into the Holy of Holies by a voice which said, "Come up hither, and I will show you what must take place after this." Revelations 4:1. These were the visions of temple mystics. There must have been more of these visions known to the early church, because Clement of Alexandria wrote that knowledge of things past, present, and future had been revealed by the Son of God, the great high priest who had passed through the curtain. Clement must have known some teachings of Jesus, which are not in the Gospels. According to Exodus 26:31, the veil was woven from blue, purple, and scarlet thread. We assume it was wool, and from fine linen, and it was Hoseb work, usually translated skilled work. Both Philo and Josephus record what was believed about the veil in the 1st century CE, that the four colors represented the four elements from which the world was made, the red being fire, the blue air, the purple water, and the white linen the earth. The Mishnah, recorded material from the same period, says that the veil was woven by young women and measured 20 by 40 cubits overall, about 10 by 20 meters. It was constructed from 72 strips of fabric, each one hand breadth wide, and must have been a valuable piece of fabric. Titus took the veil as loot when the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 CE and chose to keep it in his palace rather than putting it in a temple along with the other spoils. Later tradition records that the veil became the most precious relic in the great church in Constantinople, encased in a covering of gold and silver and suspended above the altar. Woven from the four elements, the veil which concealed the glory of God represented matter, the stuff of the visible creation. An exactly similar fabric was used for the outer vestment of the high priest, which he wore in the hall of the temple, but not in the Holy of Holies, where he wore the white linen of the angels. The colored vestment was therefore associated with his role in the visible creation, and although the Hebrew scriptures say nothing of the meaning of the high priest's vestments, Philo and Josephus reveal that the outer vestment represented the created world. The book of the Wisdom of Solomon, perhaps a century earlier than Philo and Josephus, has simply, on Aaron's robe, the whole world was depicted. Wisdom 18:24. Thus the high priest was an angel who had emerged from the Holy of Holies into the visible creation and vested himself in the stuff of creation. When he functioned in the visible creation, he also wore the sacred name on his forehead because he represented the Lord of the host dwelling with his people. Blessed is he who comes with the name of the Lord, must have been the acclamation for the high priest. The veil and the vestment being made of identical fabrics is the key to understanding the role of the high priest and the temple context of the concept of incarnation. The vested high priest in the temple was the glory of the Lord veiled in matter. Thus, the vested high priest in the temple was the glory of the Lord veiled in matter. Thus, we read of Simon, who was the high priest about 200 BC, how glorious he was as he came out of the house of the veil, like the morning star among the clouds. He made the court of the sanctuary glorious. Ben Sira 55:6-11. Elsewhere, this would be identified as the language of theophany. Hecataeus, a Greek writing about 300 BC, described the Jewish high priest as an angel, and when he spoke, the Jews immediately fell to the ground and worshipped him. Incarnation, represented by the veil, was implied by the gospel writers, who linked the death of Jesus to the tearing of the temple veil, and the letter to the Hebrews, written to an early Christian community, mentions the new and living way which he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Hebrews 10:20. The writer does not explain what is meant by this, and so we must assume that the recipients of the letter already knew what the veil represented. The world of the temple was the world of the early Christians. We know the veil and incarnation symbolism best from Charles Wesley's Christmas Carol. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. The association of the veil and incarnation is set out in the greatest detail in the infancy gospel of James, an early Christian text which depicts Mary as one of the young women chosen to weave the new temple veil. She was given the purple and red wool to spin, and she was working. The angel spoke to her. Thus, she was making the new temple veil while she was pregnant. The angel speaking to Mary as she was spinning became the icon of the Annunciation. It is possible that this was just an early legend linking the incarnation and the veil, but given that Herod was refurbishing the temple at that time, it is entirely possible that Mary had been a temple weaver working on the new veil. The incarnation as the priestly vestments is not mentioned in the letter to the Hebrews and is only implicit in other biblical texts. But Saint Simeon of Thessaloniki, died 1429, knew this meaning of vestments. The priest coming out of the sanctuary and his descent into the nave signifies the descent of Christ from heaven and his humility. That he wears priestly vestments signifies the incarnation. John recorded in the prologue to his gospel how the Word had emerged from the beginning and became flesh. Luke described the ascension as the moment when the great high priest returned to the Holy of Holies. He blessed the disciples and was taken to heaven. A cloud took him out of their sight. This is temple imagery, the high priest entering the Holy of Holies surrounded with incense. The ascension was the moment when the Lord passed from one particular time and place in the visible creation back into the Holy of Holies, the eternal present beyond the veil. Reconstructing the temple in this way and applying the results to the biblical text can never be an exact science, but as the pieces fall into place and a picture begins to emerge, the task becomes easier and the results more exciting. No created mind can by any means possess the capacity to understand all, but as soon as it has discovered a small fragment of what it is seeking, it again sees other things that must be sought for, and if in turn it comes to know these, it will again see arising out of them many more things that demand investigation. Chapter 2, Covenant. In Matthew's account of the Last Supper, we find the words, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Matthew 26:28. This is the form of words found in 3rd century papyri and in the 4th century Sinai and Vatican codices. My blood of the new covenant is found in the slightly later Alexandrinus and Bezae codices. The words in Mark are different. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." Mark 14:24. And here the word "new" is found in the Alexandrinus Codex, but not in earlier texts. The words in Luke present a considerable problem, since the covenant blood is not mentioned at all in the Western text. Paul's account in 1 Corinthians 11:25 is the only place where new covenant is the secure reading in accounts of the Last Supper. The phrase new covenant also appears in Hebrews 9:15. This is important since new and covenant are so often thought to be inseparable in Christian thinking. There must have been huge numbers of early Christians for whom the Last Supper was not about the new covenant, but about the covenant. And the question is, which covenant? Matthew generally agreed to be the gospel written for Hebrew Christians and reflecting their special concerns, also has the words "for the remission of sins." Perhaps this was a further definition of the covenant, necessary for a Hebrew community which knew several covenants. The covenant in question was the one which dealt with remission of sins. The first covenant mentioned in the Old Testament was the covenant with Noah, the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. Genesis 9:16. The creation would be secure and never again destroyed by flood. This covenant does not mention remission of sins. The second covenant was that with Abraham and was the promise of heirs and land. Genesis 15:18 through 21. Again, no mention of remission of sins. The third was at Sinai, when Israel undertook to keep the 10 Commandments, and although there was no reference to sin in that account, there was the phrase "blood of the covenant." The fourth covenant was with the royal house, that their throne and kingdom would be established forever. 2 Samuel 7:12. No mention of remission of sins. Jeremiah looked forward to a new covenant, not like the covenant at Sinai, but written on the heart. And here there is reference to forgiveness of sins. Jeremiah 31:34. There follow in Jeremiah 2 sayings which begin, "Thus says the Lord," and the compiler of the Jeremiah scroll thought it appropriate at this point to include 2 oracles based not on the Sinai covenant, but on the covenant with Noah, the everlasting covenant. The security of Israel was part of the fixed order of creation, and only if this was destroyed would Israel cease to exist. Everlasting covenant is perhaps not the best way to translate the Brit Olam. The Hebrew dictionary offers two meanings for the consonants translated everlasting. It can be either ancient, perpetual, the remote future and eternity, or it can be hidden, secret. In fact, these should not be distinguished as two meanings, because in the world of the temple, the hidden, secret place was the eternal state outside time, and so this everlasting covenant would have been connected to the Holy of Holies. This explains why the everlasting covenant was also described as the covenant of peace, Salom, another word associated with the state beyond the veil. The consonants of Salom, variously pointed, mean complete, sound, secure, restored, and made good, and include the idea of the judgment necessary to bring this about. The related verb can mean requite. A story about Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, will illustrate how this covenant was understood. A man of Israel married a woman of Midian in the time when such things were forbidden. It was a blatant breach of the covenant law, and Israel was in danger because the covenant had been broken. Plague broke out, and the people wept at the door of the tent meeting. Numbers 25:6. From the way the story was told, we conclude that the covenant was envisaged as protection for Israel, and any breach of the covenant exposed them to danger, sometimes described as wrath. When Phinehas the high priest took his spear and killed the offending couple, the plague ceased. Because of his action to protect the covenant, the Lord gave to Phinehas and his descendants my covenant of Salom, the covenant of the priesthood of eternity, or the covenant of eternal priesthood, because he made atonement for the people of Israel. Numbers 25:12-13. My translation. The covenant of peace was therefore linked exclusively to the high priesthood and entailed making atonement to repair any breach in the covenant which exposed the people to danger. This high priestly covenant must have been the covenant of the Last Supper, since it dealt with putting away sins, the literal meaning of the word translated remission in Matthew's account. And it was the covenant restored by an act of atonement, another major New Testament theme which is not associated with any of the historic covenants in the Old Testament. This priestly covenant has been much neglected in our reading of the Old Testament, overshadowed as it is by the historic covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. It would also be true to say that priestly theology has received little attention because of the concentration on Deuteronomy. The assumption that Deuteronomy was the norm has led to a number of distortions in our perception and presentation of the Old Testament, which has two distinct theologies. There is the temple theology, concerned with wisdom and with the structure and harmony of the creation, and the Deuteronomic theology, which is focused on the figure of Moses and the history of Israel as the chosen people. It is the Deuteronomic theology which has come to dominate the popular view of Old Testament theology. The fact that the Deuteronomic strand had no creation theology, no place for atonement, no place for the anointed kings of the house of David, no place for prophets except insofar as they agreed with Moses, and no place for wisdom tradition was, curiously, not seen as a problem. Wisdom was assigned to the periphery and apocalyptic to the appendix. Wisdom was assigned to the periphery and apocalyptic to the appendix, a late decline due to foreign influence, it was suggested. The priestly theology saw the pattern of history as a whole, revealed in the Holy of Holies as past, present, and future. It was the Deuteronomists who made history an interpretation of past events, made Moses the center of their scheme, and gradually attributed to Moses the royal traditions of the temple. It was the Deuteronomists who forbade the secrets of the Holy of Holies, and thus had no creation theology. Deuteronomy 29:29. They based their religion on the visible material creation. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. And he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is, the 10 Commandments. And he wrote them on tablets of stone. Deuteronomy 4:12-13. The Deuteronomists made the Mosaic covenant the keystone of their system. There has been a long debate about the form and pedigree of the Deuteronomic style of covenant, whether or not it was modeled on a political treaty form, and if so, whose. Had the covenant been strictly a business arrangement between the Lord and Israel? Was this form of covenant even known before the 7th century, when the Deuteronomists became influential in the southern kingdom? And where did they come from anyway? All these questions have been asked, and for good reason, but no satisfactory answer has been given. There is much evidence to suggest that there was a theological and literary revolution in between the first temple and the second, and that what we understand as the Old Testament includes a massive reworking of First Temple material. There is much evidence to suggest that there was a theological and literary revolution in between the First Temple and the Second, and that what we understand as the Old Testament includes a massive reworking of First Temple material. The importance of this for Christians is the fact that the roots of Christianity are in the First Temple traditions, and so we have to try to recover what lies beneath the reworked materials. The older faith, underlying the historic covenants recorded in the Old Testament was the everlasting covenant, and we can see how even this covenant came to be historicized as the older traditions received their familiar form under the influence of the Deuteronomists in the early years of the Second Temple. The priestly material in the Noah story described how God made the everlasting covenant with Noah, and this covenant guaranteed the stability of the creation forever. The implication was that the priestly ministry of atonement would no longer be necessary to maintain the stability and harmony of the implication was that the priestly ministry of the atonement would no longer be necessary to maintain the stability and harmony of the creation. These same Second Temple priests wrote Genesis 1 and were silent about the angels of day 1. They turned the myths of the temple into history, and thus the myths lost their power. Genesis 1 happened a long time ago. Adam and Eve were history, and so on. The temple traditions preserved in the Enoch books, however, regard the builders of the Second Temple as impure apostates and tell the history of their people without mentioning Moses and the Exodus. The Damascus document, a key text among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the whole of the Second Temple period as the Age of Wrath. Since wrath was the result of breaking the covenant, this must have been the era of the broken covenant. The groups who looked for the new covenant may well have been looking for the renewed covenant, the restoration of the older faith. Keywords in the older system were given new meanings by the Deuteronomists. Cleave usually means to unite with. The leprosy of Naaman shall cleave to you. 2 Kings 5:27. My bones cleave to my flesh. Psalms 102:5. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. Psalm 137:6. Cleaving to the Lord must have meant something similar, but for the Deuteronomists, cleaving meant obedience, not union. You shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and you shall serve him and cleave to him. Deuteronomy 13:4. But one can hardly imagine Adam cleaving to his wife being understood as absolute obedience to her. Cleaving is but one example of how the Deuteronomists had their own meanings for key theological terms. In the later mystical tradition, which had its root in the ancient temple, cleaving was understood to mean a mystical union. And R. Akiva insisted that this was how the word was to be understood. Cleaving unto the Lord your God, literally cleaving, this is the unity of the Holy of Holies. But the Deuteronomists had their own secular adaptation of the word. Remember is another word characteristic of the Deuteronomists. It was remembering their common history that bound Israel together as the chosen people and gave them their characteristic way of life. Remember what Amalek did to you. Deuteronomy 25:17. The distinction between the two theologies can be illustrated by the two versions of the fourth commandment. Keep the Sabbath day, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and rested the seventh day. Exodus 20:11. Or keep it because you shall remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and your servants too must be given a day of rest. Deuteronomy 5:14-15. The one appeals to the natural order of things, living in harmony with the pattern of creation, and the other to history. These are the two strands in Old Testament theology. Now, the consonants for this key word remember can also be translated invoke, which is priestly temple activity, and this has led to interesting ambiguities. For example, when the Lord revealed his name to Moses at the burning bush, Moses was told, "Thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." Exodus 3:15. Or, "This is how I am to be invoked throughout all generations." The Hebrew can mean either. According to the chronicler, the music of the Levites was to invoke the Lord, 1 Chronicles 16:4. But the Deuteronomists mention no music. The Deuteronomists remember the Lord, whereas the priests invoked the presence. If Jesus spoke either Hebrew or Aramaic at the Last Supper, his words, "Do this in remembrance of me," will have had the same ambiguity. He could have also meant, "Do this as my invocation." The eternal covenant. The covenant of eternity. the priestly covenant, which was overshadowed by the more political Mosaic form. The covenant of eternity, the priestly covenant, which was overshadowed by the more political Mosaic form, was the bonds which held the created order in place. There is a vivid picture of this covenant, albeit when broken, in Isaiah 24. The earth moans and withers. The earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few men are left. Isaiah 24, 4-6. The priestly covenant manifests itself as the laws and the statutes, and when these are broken, the earth withers away and the creation collapses. The Deuteronomists also taught about statutes and ordinance, but when they were broken, Israel lost possession, the key word, of the land. Deuteronomy 4:1. Statutes is an interesting word. Literally, it means something engraved. And violated the statutes is literally they have gone through the engraved thing. These engraved things were the divine plans in the Holy of Holies made before the three-dimensional visible creations. Proverbs 8:27-29 was wisdom's description of the sequence of the creation, since she had been in the beginning, the Holy of Holies beside the Creator. In other words, this was a vision like that of Genesis 1, except that wisdom revealed details of day 1 which are not in Genesis. Wisdom had been beside the Creator when he engraved a circle on the face of the deep, when he set for the sea its engraved mark, when he engraved the foundations of the earth. All this happened before the mountains were shaped and the earth was formed, so the engraved state proceeded or lay beneath the material world. Jeremiah knew that the sea had an engraving of eternity which it could not pass. Jeremiah 5:22. He knew that there were engravings for the moon and the stars. Everything had its engraved place and its limit. Human life was defined. You have made his engraving, and he cannot pass it. Since Job 14:5, my translation, he is in the unity, and who will cause him to revoke? He will complete, a word from Salome, what is engraved for me, and many things like this are with him. Job 23:13-14, translating literally. The eternal laws for human society were also engraved, as was the course of human history in the calendar. The familiar words of Psalm 2 are literally, I will tell of my engraving, or the engravings. The Lord said to me, you are my son today. I have begotten you. Psalm 2:7, translating literally. According to Clement of Alexandria, the Gnostic Theodotus taught that the sun had been drawn in outline in the beginning, a clear reference to this state of existence which preceded solidity and matter. A temple memory in the Jerusalem Talmud was that Solomon drew pictures of all sorts of trees in the temple, and these pictures also produced fruit when the corresponding trees outside produced fruit. According to 3rd Enoch 39:1-2, the throne of glory was engraved with names, and when these flew off, they became angels, and a Palestinian Targum records that the image of Jacob sleeping at Bethel was engraved on the throne above. Psalm something or other. Okay, these engravings were known as surat, which I shall not attempt to translate. The word is used in the Qumran hymns to describe the heavenly beings in the Holy of Holies. Surat of living Elohim gods, surat of luminous spirits, figures of surat of Elohim engraved. The word surat, which is a plural form, only occurs in post-biblical texts, but the singular form, sur, appears throughout the Old Testament, where it is translated rock, a word with the same consonants. Sometimes rock is an appropriate translation, but there are many places where rock does not appear in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and so the bilingual translator must have known that at that point the word had another meaning. Thus, in Isaiah 30:29, rock of Israel became in the Greek God of Israel, or Isaiah 44:8, is there a God beside me? There is no rock. I know no other. Became in the Greek, there is no God except me. This means that the familiar Rock of Ages, Isaiah 26:4, in the Greek, the great eternal God, was probably the Sur of the Holy of Holies. The secrets of day 1, which do not appear in Genesis, included a description of everything created in that state. There were the angels of the weathers and seasons, for example, but also all the spirits of his creatures which are in heaven and on earth. These must have been the engraved things, the surrogate of all the living things in the Holy of Holies. Those who broke the eternal covenant had gone beyond the law, broken through and destroyed on earth what had been engraved in the Holy of Holies. On earth as it is in heaven would be a good description of the creation as it was intended to be, but sinners had caused the covenant to collapse, and with it the creation. I should like now to quote two passages from a scholar of Islam, William Chittick, who describes an exactly similar system in Muslim thought, using similar words. They too have this temple concept of oneness of being, or unity of existence, and recognize that everything in creation has its haq, its own truth and proper place. He wrote, God, who is the absolute haq, has given each thing in the universe a creation and a guidance, and the things creation and guidance are its haq because they tie it back to the first haq. The things creation can be understood as its actual reality and its guidance as the path it must follow to achieve the fullness of what it is to become. In other words, creation refers to the fact that each thing has come from God, and guidance refers to the fact that God has provided each with a path that it follows in returning to its creator. The absolute haq is God himself, who is the basis for every other haq. The Quran says, wherever you turn, there is the face of God. The goal of tahqiq is to see the face of God wherever you turn, in every creature and in oneself, and then to act according to the haq of God's face. If we understand anything in the universe without taking the divine face into account, then we have lost the thing's haq. By losing sight of the thing's haq, we have lost sight of God. And by losing sight of God, we have lost sight of the declaration of the unity of God. Tawhid. In him, all things hold together. Returning now to the temple theme and the eternal covenant rooted in the Holy of Holies, there is an interesting and ambiguous relationship between the Holy of Holies, in which were the engraved things, and the second person, to use the Christian terminology for a moment. This is not inappropriate in an Old Testament context, as I shall show in the next chapter. The most holy place and the most holy one had a similar role. Both, for example, being veiled in the fabric which represented matter. Consider now the prologue to John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, that is the Logos, who is the second person of the Trinity. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. John 1:1 and 4. The Logos here is the vessel holding all life, exactly as the Holy of Holies held all life. Consider Colossians 1. He is the firstborn of all creation, for in him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. And there follows a list of heavenly powers, presumably equivalent to the angels of day one. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Colossians 1:15-17, italics added. Here, the firstborn is a state in which all life originates. He precedes all things, and in him all things hold together. The firstborn is thus the bond of the creation, the bond of unity, and this unity is the unity of day one. So we have the Logos in the world, and the world in the Logos. We are in Christ, Romans 12:5, and Christ is in us, Romans 8:10. Peter's sermon in Solomon's porch described Jesus as the author of life, Acts 3:15. Let us now look at these bonds of creation, which were the eternal covenant, and the seal which secured them. In him all things hold together. Let us now look at these bonds of creation, which were the eternal covenant, and the seal. Let us now look at these bonds of creation, which were the eternal covenant, and the seal which secured them. In him, all things hold together. First, we need to consider the Hebrew words used in Genesis 1 to describe the process of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Created, bara, is a verb used only of divine activity, and here in Genesis, it is divine activity in the Holy of Holies, the state which precedes or underlies the visible creation. This verb is seldom found outside the priestly texts in the Pentateuch and the second Isaiah. This divine activity produced heaven and earth, Genesis 1:1, the sea monsters, Genesis 1:21, and human beings, Genesis 1:27, the host of heavens, Isaiah 40:26, righteousness, Isaiah 45:8, new and hidden things, new heavens and a new earth. It also produced the anointed cherub described in Ezekiel 28. Thus, there were various types of creative activity in Genesis 1. There was the uniquely divine bara, as well as separating. God separated the waters. And making. God made the beasts of the earth. The visible creation, apart from humans and sea creatures, was not the result of the exclusively divine activity. The word bara is similar in sound and form to the word covenant, berith, and the Hebrew dictionary suggests that the root meaning of covenant is to bind. This similarity of the word for covenant and binding and for the uniquely divine creative activity leads me to suspect that it is the key to the older creation story, that the words had been related. Creating in the Holy of Holies was a process of binding into bonds, engraving limits and definitions, and then using them to order the visible creation. When the Lord spoke to Job, the word bara is similar in sound and form to the word covenant, birth, and the Hebrew dictionary suggests that the root meaning of covenant is to bind. This similarity of the words for covenant and binding and for the uniquely divine creative activity leads me to suspect that it is the key to the older creation story, that the words had been related. Creating in the Holy of Holies was a process of binding into bonds, engraving limits and definitions, and then using them to order the visible creation. When the Lord spoke to Job from the whirlwind and reminded him that he did not have the wisdom of those who had witnessed the creation, he said, "Who shut in the sea and prescribed bounds, my engraved thing, for it, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no farther." Job 38, 8-11. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Job 38:31. Do you know the ordinances, engraved things of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on the earth? Job 38:33. A word which does not appear elsewhere in the Hebrew scripture. This is significant. It clearly refers to the correspondence between earth and heaven and is from the same root as a word for writing and for subordinate scribes. There are many similar examples of the Creator defining and restraining the forces of the natural world. The covenant also restrained and bound the king and rulers. Psalm 2 depicts kings of the earth and rulers plotting against the Lord and his Messiah to break free from their bonds. The word implies imprisonment, and from their cords, a word suggesting something woven together. The Lord and his Messiah must have maintained both the natural and the social order by means of bonds and weavings, and this was the eternal covenant. R. Nehemiah, a temple mystic early in the 2nd century CE, saw in his visions the very bonds of the covenant, the mysteries and the secrets, the bonds and the wonders, the weaving of the web that completes the world. The fullest picture of the eternal covenant is found in the Enoch literature, which preserves fragments of a poem about the great oath which binds the creation. These are the secrets of this oath. The heaven was suspended before the creation of the world, and forever, and through it the earth was founded upon the water, from the creation of the world and unto eternity. And through that oath the sea was created, and he set the sand against the time of anger, and it dare not press beyond it from the creation of the world unto eternity. And through that oath the depths are made fast, and through that oath the sun and moon complete their course, and through that oath the stars complete their course. 1 Enoch 69. The great oath also bound the spirits of the waters and the winds, the voice of the thunder and the light of